Next presentation is going to come from Kojo Amanor, and is going to be presenting on intensification, agriculture, and extractives. Please do come forward, sir.
Thank you very much. I'd like to say what a great pleasure it is to be here. And I'm looking forward to the feedback I get from you. Yeah. So the title I was given was Agricultural Intensification Extractives. But I decided that the intensification was enough to deal with. So I'm just going to deal with the concept of intensification and efficiency. So what I'm trying to do here is look at the different doctrines of development which have informed the concept of efficiency in agriculture and intensification, and the relationship, the importance, significance or lack of significance of smallholders and large-scale agriculture. And continually there are shifts. There's always going backwards and forwards from smallholders. Yeah, we have to have smallholder as a focus of agriculture policy. And then it's no, we need to focus on large-scale agriculture. And this goes all the way back to the beginnings of the colonial period. So I want to take it historically, look at different arguments in different times. But of course, mainly concerned with the arguments in the present. But by looking at how arguments shift, it gives us some idea of how concepts, theories, and doctrines about development are formed, and the kinds of things which informs their development. So I'm concerned with the cyclical shifts in doctrines about changing conditions of production. And I'm interested in understanding the values, yeah, underlying the positions which are taken by different theoreticians about intensification. So let's go back to the colonial period. So the first problem is, if you're starting a commercial, you're going to start commercial agriculture, is you need labor. You can't do anything without wage labor if you want to do. So the early debates in the 1890s under constructivist imperialism in Britain, this was Chamberlain, so this is before the development of indirect rule. The objective was to conquer the interior, to make way for European farmers using African labor, yeah. But as the conquest proceeded, there was a difficulty in recruiting free labor, yeah. And then the colonial authorities, to get labor, and this isn't only in the agricultural sector, it's also in the mining sector. So then they began to impose forced labor, and then other means of coercion through taxation, yeah. And there were problems with forced labor and coercion, yeah. And so there were problems with the ILO, yeah. And what happened was that the African crop producers also began to take advantage of colonial to recruit labor for production. Yeah. So it's no coincidence that the main areas in which cash cropping developed kind of the model examples was in the Gold Coast, which was also a mining, after South Africa, that was the next big frontier in mining, yeah. And as indirect rule began to establish itself, it began to discourage large European estate cultivation. And the settler-wide colonies in British policy were considered to be more of a problem. The ideal form of colonial exploitation occurred through small-scale or African production. Yeah. So I want to look at these developments in cocoa because it really, that was one of the first major sectors, export sectors in the colonial economy, which became significant. So cocoa production in Africa begins in the 1800s, yeah, on the islands of Sao Tome and Principe, off the coast of Central Africa, yeah, Central West Africa, yeah. And this was Portuguese plantations, and they were using indentured and slave labor, largely recruited from Angola, Congo, yeah. So by the late 19th century, we begin to see the rise of the imperialist jingoism in Europe. And the justification for the colonization of Africa is very similar to the kind of things we hear about today. It's a humanitarian, that Africa needs to be conquered for humanitarian aims to halt domestic slavery within Africa. So the problem then became that so you had this sentiment against slavery. We need to end slavery in West Africa. And the dominant forms of production were using European farmers using slave labor, yeah. So then the major cocoa producer, Cadbury's, had to look for alternative supplies. And these it found in the Gold Coast, yeah. So there was a shift from large European estates to African production. But the African production wasn't smallholder peasant. It was based on the use of labor, yeah. So it took advantages of the taxation policies in British and colonial, yeah, areas to expand. Yeah, and in the article referred to yesterday by Ruth, by Samir Amin, he makes this point that the zones of peasant production in West Africa were not the areas characterized by lineage. He says that the anthropologists have confused the mode of production with the social formation. So in these areas, you have highly developed states, centralized states, divisions between town and country. You have a distinct emergence of traders, towns, and you have a subjugation of rural producers. Yeah, so you have all kinds of different relationships emerging out of domestic slavery into feudal type of relations in the Hausa Emirates. So the most advanced forms of agriculture in this country occurred in the Hausa Emirates in northern Nigeria, which were by far the most powerful states in this area. Yeah. And so if, for instance, now if you go into the literature on cocoa, you'll find that the main book in the 40s and in the 60s by Polly Hill characterizes the cocoa farmers of Ghana as capitalist farmers. And so these people came from urban areas. They were traders. They started off trading in oil palm and rubber, and then they accumulated the capital and they used it, moved into cocoa. So they moved from oil palm into cocoa, yeah. And they purchased land and they hired labor. So this was quite expansive at that time, yeah. Now, in contrast with the development, and by 1920s, the Gold Coast provided 80% of cocoa in the world. Yeah. Now, in contrast with this, in neighboring Côte d'Ivoire, the French colonialists attempted to develop an expatriate, a white settler planter class. And this never took off because they couldn't compete with the Gold Coast. The farmers in the Gold Coast used the labor reserves created by the French in the Sahelian region, in Francophone Sahelian, to recruit their own labor. And they provided better of terms. So the labor, the surplus, the migrant labor went to the Gold Coast rather than to the French colonies. Yeah. And it was only after the French gave up on promoting French estate agriculture in Côte d'Ivoire that cocoa production in Côte d'Ivoire eventually took off and came to surpass Ghanaian cocoa production. So in that context, the African producers were more efficient than the French settler farmers, in contrast with what occurred in Southern Africa. But the successes we see in cocoa were not replicated in all agricultural sectors. So like I said, the cocoa farmers started off in oil palm, but then oil palm, which was an indigenous West African crop, was taken to Southeast Asia, and there was grown on European large estate corporations by large estate farms. And they were able to produce on a scale that the West Africans could no longer compete with. And now it was no longer productive, yeah, for them to grow cocoa, so oil palm, so they converted to cocoa. Now, the interesting thing is that oil palm is much easier to cultivate than cocoa. Cocoa is very vulnerable to pests and diseases. Oil palm is quite resistant, yeah. So I suspect that in most sectors, this is a familiar pattern. What happens is that large commercial agriculture can dominate the easier crops to cultivate, yeah, and then they leave the problem crops for the smallholders. So the smallholders become responsible for all the crops with all the problems in the world, and yeah. So although you have the expansion of small peasant hold cultivation in West Africa, there's a lot of angst in the colonialism about this. On the one hand, they prevent development of large-scale European estates in West Africa. So when Leverhulme are looking for oil palm plantations, they have to go to, and despite the fact that they come from Britain, they have to go to the French Congos before they can get land for their plantations. Yeah. But the colonial authorities, they become concerned about the backwardness of African peasant agriculture. Yeah. That it's not modernization. It's not modernization. It's not following the recommendations they make. So we get a new set of solutions. One is to develop large state schemes like the Gazeria scheme in Sudan, the Office du Niger, yeah. And these lead into the Commonwealth Development Corporation schemes in the 1950s. And it formed one of the routes going into contract farming. So here you have state beginning to regulate, form large projects, begin to supply inputs to farmers, and an element of coercion which comes in, and this goes forward under independence into the state schemes. So these large state schemes lay the foundations for the emergence of contract farming. Yeah. And in the smallholder sector, there's a crisis of pest and diseases. Yeah, so it's not a crisis. One of the major crises which comes in the 50s is of diseases, both of maize and cocoa. Yeah, so there's a maize rust which spreads throughout East Africa and West Africa, and this is the event which brings about the beginning of agricultural research extension stations, experimental stations, not increasing yield, but the problem of dealing with pests. So that's a scenario. And in the 1950s, there's also a big change in the world. So the US emerges as the dominant power alongside the Soviet Union. And now the US begins to dominate agricultural modernization. And the object of development now, because of developments in Southeast Asia, where the US is, the first interventions are there, and it's in the context of containing communism. So the first declaration on development is the Truman Point 4 declaration. And the object of development is to contain communism. And the first policies are through radical land reform, because this is what is happening in those areas which are dominated by national liberation struggles under the led by communist parties like in Korea, China, Vietnam, and So the first policies are about land reform and carrying out a radical land redistribution, of old, what were considered old feudal systems, latifundia, sharecropping, and things. So this is what begins to inform the developments of the doctrine of agricultural modernization. And the early forms of this are on distributing land on a small scale, breaking up large estates and then to smallholders. And the theory is that the smallholders' efficiency will lead to competition. And gradually what will happen is the most efficient will begin to purchase land and the least efficient will sell land. And you'll have the emergence of an efficient capitalist agricultural sector. Which, because of its competition from a low level, is intensive, highly intensive. And this is, in this context, this is where the theory of the inverse relationship, that smallholder cultivates more efficiently, that small farms have higher outputs per area of land than large farms. So this radical land reform is rapidly done away with, and it's undermined by the expropriation of by radical nationalist movements of the larger states of US corporations. So the most important is in 1953, when in Guatemala they expropriate the lands of the United Fruit Company, the US multinational, and the US responds by instigating a coup d'etat in Guatemala, which is the first of the coups which arise from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So this leads to a change in focus to a green revolution. And the green revolution is based on a technological revolution. It's to contain the red revolution through new technology. And the idea is that you promote the uptake by progressive wealthy farmers. And when the smallholders see what they're doing, they'll take up the new technology. So you get a trickle down from progressive, large, wealthy farmers to the small farmers. And there are two problems which emerge with the Green Revolution approach, from the US perspective. The first one is the new technology did not perform well under smallholder farms in rain-fed conditions in Africa. They didn't achieve the high yields. And the second one was that the Soviet Union and China still continued to have influence over agricultural development in state farms, collective farms, cooperatives. So now we have two directions developing. The first one is farming systems research. And the object of farming systems research is to adapt new seeds to the conditions of small farmers, to conditions of rain-fed agriculture. So this involves farmer participatory trials, adaptive experimentation with farmers' varieties, focus on indigenous knowledge, learning about how farmers cope their strategies, their preferences in multi-cropping, intercropping, risk management, yeah. And adapting commercial seeds, mixing them with local seeds, so they adopt that they have the characteristics of hardiness that the local seeds possess. So many of the modern seeds now, which are being promoted, originate from this process, originate from this experimentation, combine some of the characteristics of the local varieties like early maturing, drought resistance, yeah, which are now attributed to be characteristic not of local varieties, but of improved commercial varieties. And the second response was a critique of state agricultural policies, yeah. So this leads to the creation of the theoretical framework, which we call new institutional economics now. So this starts with theories of induced evolution, yeah. So that agricultural policy needs to reflect which factors are scarce and the real conditions on the ground, yeah. And that the state distorts agricultural policies by patronage of wealthy farmers, by its own investments in state farms, yeah. And this leads to Michael Lipton's theory of urban bias, yeah. Yeah. So this builds upon the earlier framework of the inverse relation. So it says that smallholders are more efficient if their existing constraints are solved, yeah. So where you have scarcity of capital, abundance of land, availability of labor, then labor solutions which focus on labor intensity rather than capital are more successful. And if you solve the bottlenecks they face, then smallholders will produce more than large scale farmers. So that smallholder cultivation with adoption of modern inputs is the most efficient form of agriculture. And this takes the kind of leading forms now become to be sort of contract models now, yeah, contract farming relations. So you have, as what Lipton argues, I think, that the efficiency comes from the combination of different scales of smallholders with large-scale estate farm. Yeah, yeah. And but at the same time, you have the development of US agribusiness models now, and the basis of this is what Cochrane calls the technology treadmill, yeah. So the technology treadmill is a theory that that agricultural technology has a high cost, yeah, innovation, yeah, and it creates competition, yeah. So those who survive have to be most efficient. And what happens is those who are least efficient perish, but this results in a more efficient agriculture in the long term, yeah. So that's one way of looking at it. And so one of the articles I gave you was a Rawlings article. Now, Rawlings moves from a farming systems perspective, yeah. He wrote a book, Extension Science, which was all about indigenous knowledge. But by the 80s, he'd become an advocate of new institutional economics, yeah. And so he's arguing that Dutch farmers, the success of Dutch agriculture is based on the state developing an institutional structure to enable farmers to compete effectively on the technology treadmill. Yeah. So if you want to, so his thesis doesn't argue against the technology treadmill. It doesn't say that, well, the existence of a technology treadmill isn't in the best interest of farmers. It's arguing, well, this is the reality and we need to adapt to it. and African farmers need to adapt to it. So now what we need is institutional reforms to facilitate investments in innovation by large-scale agribusiness and movements of agribusiness into the provision of an agricultural technology infrastructure that would lead to increased production, intensification of agriculture and efficiency. Okay, that's one way of looking at it. Now there's another way of looking at it, which is based on a critique of agribusiness in the US. And this again grows out of Cochrane. The critique is developed by Lewington, and he argues that the major change in agricultural commercialization in the 50s is the expansion of agribusiness, which controls the processing of food and the provision of inputs. And the changes which come about is that the major value in agriculture now shifts from farm production to agribusiness. So about 10% of value goes to farmers in farm production, and 90% is captured by agribusiness. So this existence of a technology treadmill in which farmers become dependent upon technology for production leads to increasing costs, increasing indebtedness. But also now farmers begin to produce, you have to have loans. So one of the major source of loans are contractual arrangements with agribusiness corporations. So the agribusiness relations in the US arise from 1950s onwards, but they begin to expand throughout the world after new liberal reforms are introduced, market liberal reforms in the 2000s. Yeah. So now we have the expansion of food chains. Yeah, supermarkets now beginning to invest, large agribusiness corporations, now replacing government and defining what farmers can do and regulating the whole chain of production, right from the supply of inputs up to the shipping and branding and sale on Western markets. Yeah. And now the whole system of contract farming is privatized now. So where the state was trying to bring about these changes as a form of agricultural modernization, it's now private corporations, and the problem now becomes does the rapid uptake of inputs and what becomes subsidization of this now by the state, but it's a subsidization of private sector operators now. Does this lead to successful intensification, increase in yields, or is it just providing an avenue for fertilizer companies, seed companies to gain new markets? Are the enabling markets for small farmers, or are they are the main beneficiaries the fertilizer companies, the seed dealers, the large transnational corporations? And the other shift now is as these markets become privatized, yeah, and the interest becomes in the uptake of inputs. Now the main focus shifts from smallholder farmers who are going to use a minimal of inputs to medium scale and large scale farmers who are able to purchase more, who have the capital to purchase more. And so suddenly we have a shift now that the most efficient form of agriculture is medium scale. That's the only realistic future, is large scale agriculture and medium scale agriculture. Because to be realistic, we need to increase food production. This is what the this is not what I'm advocating. I'm sorry. This is the mainstream agricultural development narratives. Yeah. And another variant of this now is sustainable intensification. So as you have models of which are rooted in the problems of modern agriculture, now organizations like IFPRI, World Bank are saying that the way to solve environmental problems is through intensification. The problem is that there's extensification. Farmers are moving into more land because they're not producing as intensively. So what we need to do is encourage them to use more inputs, invest more capital in agricultural intensification so that more land can be retained for conservation, can be put under forest. And that's supposed to be a realistic scenario. I think when you look at areas like the Cerrado in Brazil, what happens is when intensification models begin to produce capital accumulation, then there's more people invest more in those because they can get more capital in return. So they put more land under cultivation, they clear more forests, and they find export markets. So now there's a dialogue between the smallholder as being the most efficient is being now there's a debate is being criticized. Yeah. So one approach is to argue that in the current situation, there's little evidence of accumulation from below. And there's little evidence of smallholders accumulating and stepping up. Yeah, the main thing is stepping up is mainly coming from people who accumulate in other sectors and then invest capital in intensive agriculture. And it's mostly coming from estates and medium-scale farmers. Yeah. So, and then the other, which you'll find in the article I sent you by Polton, is to argue that, well, there are different patterns of, in some sectors, it continues to be dominated by smallholders and others by medium-scale farmers. So what we need is structures which support both of them together. But this is still rooted in, it still adopts the framework of sustainable intensification, private sector, and advocates for private sector agribusiness, reorganization of the agricultural sector. So the issues I'd like to raise now. So I have a cousin who is well, he's retired now. He used to be Lever Brothers. He was plantation manager on the Unilever oil palm plantations in Ghana. And he decided to establish his own, when he retired, he established his own commercial outgrower scheme out. And he got support from German Development Bank, KfW. So he's running this outgrower scheme. And I can tell you it's not so successful. There are a lot of problems with it. Yeah. But one of the interesting things he told me was that he got some of the latest maize seeds. He decided he was planting maize too. So he acquired this land on the lakeshore where he got water in there. And he planted these PLAAS seeds, which originally come from South Africa, where the company has been taken over by Pioneer DuPont, which has a big presence in Ghana, a lot of NGOs working to promote his seeds. So he planted his miracle maize, and he said it all got attacked by armyworm. He got nothing from it. But he said the strange thing is all the farmers, those smallholder farmers around him, using their local varieties, the armyworm didn't attack them. They all got their maize okay. Their maize wasn't attacked. Yeah. So and yet, so this is a discourse I'm familiar with from the farming systems. I mean, this is what farming systems research was all about. Yeah, you don't see these issues being raised in the literature now. No, these modern technologies have solved all the problems. The problems are with the farmers' adoption, yeah. But in reality, when you think of it, agricultural yields they're highly variable. There's so many different factors which go into it. And this is a point that Van der Ploeg makes, that even under smallholder farm conditions, yields are variable. There's not one yield, type of yield. It all depends upon weather patterns, different soils, the skill of a farmer, pest and disease problems, and luck. Yeah. Yeah. And it's the same with commercial agriculture too. I know, so in Ghana, the cocoa services say that the average yield of smallholder farmers is 400 kilograms per hectare. But with their technology, you can get 1,000 kilograms per hectare or more, yeah. But when you look at the data from experimental stations, it actually varies in the area. Some of the areas, it goes up to 400 in some of it, where they have very good soils. And in other areas, the yields gained in the experimental are well below the 1,000. So it's not easy to ascribe a particular yield characteristics to particular types of farmers or sectors. So a lot of it is not really based on real world yields, but they're actually ideological factors influencing the way people talk about the yields. So the concepts of efficiency and intensification are used to justify particular interventions. So if you introducing an intervention which is based around smallholders and maybe smallholders integration into agribusiness, then you'll say that smallholders are the most efficient, and you bring up all kinds of data to prove that. And if you're doing the opposite, you also say that no, medium scale farmers but the fact is that in both sectors, people are falling out of production. They're having difficulties. Yeah. So what you actually have is a system of competition and intensification. Yeah. And this is not only a problem of Africa. This is a worldwide problem. So, for instance, I was looking at some things in U.S. agriculture. Yeah, and currently, 50 million people in rural America are estimated as living under stagnant conditions. Yeah. So Americans in rural areas are caught in a cycle of increasing stagnation, high poverty, dwindling economic opportunities, persistent population decline, and falling migration to urban areas. They have no prospects of a future. Yeah. So these are not problems specific to Africa. It's global problems created by capitalist agriculture. So the agrarian question as a global problem has not been solved. Yeah. And this depiction of American agriculture reminds me also in South Africa of so the concept of surplus people too, but also something I read by Ruth Hall about land reform, and the problem was, so if you give land, you break up land from commercial estates and you give it to smallholders too. Well, the problem is in the commercial sector, there's also that competition. A large number of commercial estates are falling out of production. They can't keep up with the high costs, intensification that you need to do. And then you give this land to smallholders and they don't have a hope of competing. There's this savage world of competition with cutthroat profit margins. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a problem in the current the current neoliberal conditions we live under, in which it's difficult for all kinds of agriculture to survive. Yeah, and I'm ending with that. Yeah. Thank you very much.